The Xelari arena was a cathedral of suffering, a monstrous construct of obsidian and steel. It loomed over the charred remains of a dozen dead worlds, a cosmic coliseum where the strong feasted on the weak. The crowd pulsed, a writhing mass of alien bodies, their exoskeletal ridges glistening under the eerie violet glow of the arena lights. They screamed for blood in a chorus of chittering, guttural roars. The scent of scorched metal and lingering plasma fire filled the air, laced with something fouler, burnt flesh. Another match had ended. The body of a human lay sprawled across the sands, twisted at an unnatural angle. The last fighter had lasted 36 seconds. The audience found this amusing. Some had even placed bets. Would this one scream? Would it beg? Would it die well? The Xelari were connoisseurs of suffering. To them, humanity was nothing more than a stubborn, amusing species. Good prey, amusing prey. They weren't particularly strong, nor fast, nor venomous, but they had spirit, and spirit made for an entertaining hunt. High above, the announcer's voice slithered through the air, smooth and venomous. Another failure, another broken thing. But perhaps the next will last longer. A gate hissed open at the far end of the arena. Chains rattled, a figure stepped forward, shackled, bruised, yet upright. Human, not broken, not afraid. His steps were slow, deliberate. His gaze burned with something unreadable, not panic, not fear, something else. The arena grew quiet. The Xelari had seen humans fight before, scrappy, desperate, easy to kill. But this one, there was something different in the way he moved. He didn't shuffle forward like prey. He stepped forward like a predator. And the Xelari, born killers, galaxy's finest hunters, felt something they had never felt before. An unfamiliar, creeping sensation, something dangerously close to doubt. A hush spread across the Coliseum. It wasn't silence, not truly. The Xelari never stopped moving, their chitinous limbs clicking, mandibles twitching, tendrils shifting as they tasted the air. But the roars of mockery, the bloodlust, the laughter, all of it dulled into a static hum. The human stance unsettled them. He wasn't shivering, he wasn't pleading, he wasn't broken. He stood loose, but balanced, the kind of posture one only had when they expected to fight, rather than hope to survive. From the observation platform above, a Xelari huntlord stirred in its throne. A figure wrapped in deep crimson silks, its segmented arms resting atop the throne's curved armrests. A single reflective eye pulsed in the center of its elongated skull. Interesting, it clicked its mandibles twice. A signal. Below, in the arena's pit, a mechanical drone screeched as it hovered into view, scanning the human with an array of flickering red lights. The voice of the announcer slithered back into the air. Ah. Now this is unexpected. A rematch, perhaps, or merely another lesson in where humanity belongs. Laughter rippled through the crowd again, though thinner now. Uncertain, a secondary gate groaned open. From the shadows, something enormous emerged, a Goric hound. It was a beast bred for slaughter, hulking, four-legged, with ridges of spiked carapace running down its back. Its mouth, a jagged horror of overlapping fangs, dripped with acidic saliva. Its last meal had been human. The scent still lingered on its breath. The human rolled his shoulders. No panic, no wasted movement. Just a slow exhale, misting the cold air. The huntlord leaned forward slightly, intrigued. Most humans bolted. They scrambled, they tried to run, they cowered. But this one, he just watched, calculating. The beast lunged. The human moved. Not back, forward. The Xelari barely registered the shift before the hound's massive form crashed. Into the ground, its attack missing by inches. A miscalculation, a mistake. The human had sidestepped at the last possible moment, fluid as water, positioning himself along the beast's blind spot. The audience let out a collective hiss of breath. Then he struck, not wildly, not with desperation, but with precision. His shackles were still bound, but his body was a weapon. A single brutal elbow strike drove into the beast's vulnerable joint, just below its jaw. A sickening crunch echoed as the hound recoiled, more stunned than wounded. The Hunt Lord's single eye gleamed with newfound interest. The human tilted his head, flexing his wrists against the chains. His voice, when he spoke, was low, quiet. "You enjoy watching the hunt." He glanced at the stunned hound, then up at the Hunt Lord. "So do I." A ripple of unease ran through the Xelari. They weren't sure if they had just found their next champion, or if their champion had just found them. The Goric hound was still alive. But now it was wary. It shook its monstrous head, baring those jagged, overlapping fangs. The acidic saliva dripped onto the scorched arena floor, sizzling as it met the sand. A predator of its caliber was not accustomed to missing its mark. Above, the Hunt Lord observed in eerie silence, its single eye flickering with unreadable calculation. The Xelari did not like unpredictability. It made them uncomfortable, and right now the human was something they had no precedent for. The beast lunged again, its colossal muscles bunching as it tore across the arena floor. It was faster than something of its size had any right to. Be evolution's finest instrument of murder, the crowd erupted into a frenzy. This was what they wanted. The kill, the brutality, but the human did not run. He turned toward the charging nightmare and met it head-on. The moment stretched, a heartbeat. Two, then he moved. The instant before impact, the human dropped. The audience barely had time to register the motion before the Goric hound's momentum carried it forward, over him, sailing inches above where his throat had been. But the human wasn't simply dodging. The moment he hit the ground, his shackled hands whipped up, chains wrapping around one of the beast's hind legs in a steel coil. The Xelari barely comprehended what was happening before physics did the rest. The hound's forward momentum betrayed it. One moment it was leaping, the next it was yanked. Violently off balance, a sickening snap filled the air. As its own weight shattered its hind limb, it tumbled, rolling, howling in agony. The arena floor shook as it crashed to a halt. For the first time, the coliseum was silent. The Xelari had seen humans fight, but not like this. This was not a man blindly lashing out, hoping to survive a little longer. This was a dismantling. The Hunt Lord clicked its mandibles in thought. Intriguing. Below, the human slowly stood, shaking the loose chain from his wrists, rolling his shoulders as if he had just warmed up. His gaze flicked upward toward the Hunt Lord's throne. And then he smiled. It wasn't a grin of triumph. Not arrogance, not defiance. It was something far worse. It was an invitation. The Hunt Lord tapped a clawed finger against the throne's armrest, considering. The human had done more than survive. He had turned the hunt into a game of his own, and the Xelari did not take kindly to being prey. The arena gates groaned. More figures emerged. Not beasts this time. Xelari. Warriors, armed, elite. The rules had changed. The hunt was no longer a mere spectacle. It was now personal. The Xelari warriors moved in silence. Not the wild, bloodthirsty enthusiasm of the crowd. Not the animalistic hunger of the Goric hound. No, these were something different. Killers, trained and honed. Apex hunters of the galaxy. And they had just been challenged. The Hunt Lord leaned forward on its throne, its single reflective eye flickering. This was no longer about entertainment. The human had made it a matter of dominance, of pride. And the Xelari did not tolerate threats to their supremacy. The warriors encircled him, 5 in total. No grand announcements, no showmanship, just 5 elite executioners moving with practiced lethality. In the stands, the crowd had quieted. They wanted blood. But for the first time, they were uncertain whose it would be. The human took a breath, slow and measured. His shackles were still loose around his wrists. The chains dragged against the arena floor like the remnants of a broken leash. Then, the first Xelari struck, a flash of serrated steel, moving faster than most species could react, aimed for the soft meat of the human's throat. The human didn't. "You block!" He stepped in. The blade missed by an inch as he slipped inside the warrior's range. His hands, still bound, snapped up like a vice. He caught the Xelari's wrist and twisted, pulling the warrior's own momentum against it. A sickening crunch! The alien shrieked, arms snapping at an unnatural angle. Its weapon clattered to the sand. The second warrior lunged. The human pivoted. A kick to the back of the first Xelari sent its broken form crashing into the second. Both went sprawling. The third and fourth didn't wait. One came from behind, the other from the side. The human let the shackles fall loose from his wrists. Now he was unchained, a blur of movement. He sidestepped the first attack, grabbing the chain mid-air and wrapping it around the fourth warrior's throat in a brutal arc. The alien thrashed. Clawed hands scratched at the steel coil, crushing its windpipe. But the human didn't stop moving. He twisted, using the momentum of the struggling Xelari to launch himself forward, boots cracking against the ribs of the third warrior. The Xelari, crumpled exoskeletal armor cracking. Now there was only one left standing. The last warrior hesitated, and the human smiled again. That same terrifying, knowing smile. The Xelari lunged, this time with hesitation. And hesitation was death. The human sidestepped, grabbed the alien's wrist and drove its own dagger into the soft gap between its plates. A gurgled hiss. It fell, twitching. 5 warriors, 10 seconds. The coliseum was silent. The Hunt Lord rose from its throne. For the first time in centuries, a human had not only survived the hunt, he had turned it against them. The chains lay at his feet, useless now. He exhaled. His gaze lifted toward the throne. "You're not hunting anymore," he said. "You're competing." The Hunt Lord's eye burned. Then it raised a single clawed hand and gestured. The arena gates opened. More warriors, more hunters, more killers. But the human only cracked his knuckles. The next round had begun. The arena's gates groaned open. The air shifted, not from the movement of the massive doors, but from something deeper, a change in the atmosphere itself. This was no longer a mere spectacle. This was war. The Hunt Lord had made its decision. If the human would not bow, if he would not break, then there was only one alternative. He would be made an example, a lesson in futility. More warriors flooded the arena. Not 5 this time, not 10, but an entire kill squadron. The best of the best, elite Xelari champions, each of them towering figures clad in segmented armor, weapons humming with plasma charges. The crowd erupted into a frenzied roar. Not out of excitement, out of hunger. The human flexed his fingers. His breath was steady, controlled. His body ached. He wasn't invincible, he wasn't untouchable, but he was awake and he was learning. The Xelari had spent lifetimes perfecting their hunt, but they had never hunted something like him. The warriors circled, calculating, moving in sync. A coordinated force, unlike the scattered skirmish of before. No hesitation now, no underestimation. They had learned, too. The first attack came like lightning. A spear, wreathed in blue energy, launched forward. The human twisted, not back, not away, but toward the strike inside its arc. His hand clamped over the shaft of the weapon, redirecting it mid-motion. The Xelari warrior overextended. A heartbeat later, its own spear rammed through its chest. Before its body even hit the sand, another was upon him. Claws, plasma knives, bladed gauntlets, all flashing death. The human was forced to retreat, his movements no longer calculated. Dominance but sheer adaptation. Step, duck, pivot, move. His world narrowed into strikes, counters, and survival. Too many, too fast. They were evolving. But so was he. The first opening came in the form of an error. A warrior misjudged the reach of its own comrade's blade. Too close, too aggressive. The human capitalized. A redirect, a twist, a kill. One down. Then another momentum. He flowed through them, a storm of motion, using their own techniques against them. No wasted movement, no fear, and then a sudden pulse. A searing pain tore through his ribs, forcing him back. His vision blurred, breath hitching. A plasma blade had found its mark. The Hunt Lord's voice slithered into the air, smooth as venom. You fight well, human, but all things tire, all things fall. The words carried weight. The Xelari didn't need to defeat him in skill. They only needed time. A slow realization crept into the human's mind. This wasn't about killing him. This was about proving he could be killed. Bleeding, breathing harder, steps slightly slower, and the crowd. They felt it. They sensed it. The momentum shifting. Was alone. He was wounded. He was human. The Xelari were many. The Hunt Lord's mandibles clicked in satisfaction. The hunt was almost over. And then a new sound. Not the roar of the crowd. Not the hum of plasma weapons. Something else. A distant blast. The arena shook. The Xelari warriors hesitated. The Hunt Lord's eye flickered. The monitors around the coliseum flickered with static. Something was wrong. The human turned his gaze upward. Past the Hunt Lord, past the towering walls of the arena. Smoke rising from the spires above. Then another blast. An alarm blared. The Hunt Lord's throne room doors burst open, and a frantic Xelari officer rushed in, eyes wide with something utterly alien on its face. Fear. The perimeter is breached, it hissed. A fleet, human vessels, they... Another explosion rocked the coliseum. The arena floor cracked. Dust and debris rained down from above, and for the first time in Xelari history, the hunt was interrupted. The Colosseum trembled beneath the force of the explosions. For centuries, the Xelari had ruled their hunt worlds with absolute authority. The arenas had never been breached. Their empire had never been challenged on their own soil. Until now, the Hunt Lord's single, unblinking eye flickered with calculations, its mandibles clicking in sharp agitation. The reports came fast, desperate. Human warships inside the sector. Perimeter forces compromised. The city defenses are... Another explosion. This time inside the Coliseum walls. A shockwave ripped through the arena, sending plumes of dust and fire into the air. A portion of the upper stands collapsed under the impact, taking dozens of screaming Xelari spectators with it. Panic erupted in the seats. The crowd, once hungry for blood, was now fighting to escape. The human exhaled, steadying himself. He was injured. Breathing was harder. The plasma wound burned like molten metal along his ribs. But something shifted in his stance. The Xelari could feel it. He was no longer fighting against time. Time had arrived for him. Across the battlefield, the Hunt Lord stood. The creature did not run, did not recoil like the lesser Xelari scrambling for safety. No! It did what predators did best. It adapted. So, the pack has come to retrieve its lost cub. Its voice carried across the carnage, smooth as a blade. But... Tell me, human, do you think they are here for you, or for something else? The Hunt Lord's claws tapped against the armrest of its throne, a signal. The arena floor groaned. Massive metal gates along the edges of the Colosseum slammed open, and, from the shadows, the real hunters emerged. They weren't warriors, they weren't beasts, they were something worse. The Xelari Apex Elites, not genetic outliers, bio-augmented killers, the few Xelari who had survived planetary hunts against the deadliest species in the galaxy, and now they surrounded the human. This was no longer a battle, it was a challenge, a final test, before the war outside could reach them. The Hunt Lord tilted its head, considering. Kill him before the ships land. No weapons, no plasma. Prove that we are still the masters of this sport. The apex elites charged. The human grinned, and he ran toward them, straight into the heart of the hunt. The apex elites were already moving before the human had finished his first step. No hesitation, no wasted motion. The best of the best. They had been honed in blood, tested in fire. They had slaughtered apex predators on death worlds, stalked prey that entire fleets had failed to capture. Their bodies were built for the kill, thicker armor plating, enhanced reflexes, bones reinforced with carborite alloys. Against them a wounded human, outnumbered, outmatched by all logic. He should not have stood a chance, and yet the Hunt Lord watched in pure fascination as the human did not retreat. He did not hesitate. He did not second-guess. He ran straight at them. The first apex elite lunged, its clawed forearms unfolding like blades, its mandibles spread, bearing venom-tipped fangs. The human dived low, a blur of motion. Sand erupted beneath him as he slid under the lunge, barely an inch from being impaled. His hands shot out, grabbing hold of the creature's inner arm, using its own momentum to drag it off balance. The Xelari stumbled, and in that fraction of a second, the human turned its own body into a weapon. A rising elbow slammed into the alien's exposed throat, a sickening wet crunch. The apex elite staggered, choking. The second was already attacking, faster than any normal warrior. But the human was faster. He didn't block, didn't try to absorb the hit. He redirected a sidestep, a grip on the wrist, a twist at just the right moment. The elite's own momentum snapped its arm out of place. Its screeching howl was drowned by the roar of the crowd. They had come to witness a hunt. Now they were watching an ascension. The Hunt Lord's mandibles tightened. The human wasn't winning because he was stronger. He wasn't winning because he was faster. He was winning because he understood this was not war. This was adaptation. The third apex elite struck from behind. Blinding speed, a blur of serrated limbs. The human didn't need to see it. He heard the shift in the sand. He moved. The instant before impact, he arched backward, a perfect matrix-like dodge, watching as the blades carved through empty space where his spine had been. And before the Xelari could recover, he snapped upward. A brutal headbutt drove into the warrior's mandibles, shattering its sensory spines. It reeled, stunned, long enough for the human to pivot and drive a knee into its ribcage. Another down. The fourth and fifth attacked simultaneously. The human breathed. He embraced the storm. A sidestep here. A block there, a redirection, a slip, a counter. They were stronger, they were faster, they were designed for war. But the human had something they didn't, a will to defy, a refusal to submit. And in less than 45 seconds, 5 apex elites lay motionless in the sand, some alive, some not. The Hunt Lords slowly stood. For the first time in Xelari history, one of their own champions had fallen to prey. The coliseum was dead silent. And then, a single, chittering voice. It wasn't a scream. It wasn't outrage. It was a sound of approval, a Xelari noble clicking its mandibles, then another and another until dozens. Then hundreds, then thousands of Xelari spectators were clicking, their equivalent of applause. The human exhaled. The fight was over, but something deeper had just begun. And the Hunt Lord knew it. You are not prey, it admitted at last. Its voice, for the first time, lacked certainty. Then what are you? The human wiped blood from his mouth, and he smiled. A champion. The Coliseum still trembled from the battle outside, but within its walls, something far greater had been shaken. The human stood, breathing heavily, blood dripping down his ribs. Not all of it was his. Around him, the apex elites lay broken. Their bodies twitched in the sand, proof that the impossible had just happened. The Xelari had hunted humans for sport. Now, one stood unbroken before them. The Hunt Lord's mandibles twitched, its reflective eye flickering as it observed the battlefield. Its mind worked quickly, running through centuries of doctrine of natural order. The laws of the hunt were absolute, and yet the clicking of mandibles still echoed from the stands, thousands of Xelari approving, acknowledging. This was not defiance. This was admiration. The Hunt Lord knew it then. The Xelari would never see humans the same way again. The rules had changed. The power had shifted. The hunt was no longer a mere game. It was a proving ground. The human tilted his head slightly, watching the Hunt Lord, waiting for its decision, for the next step in this game. The Hunt Lord considered its options. It could order the human executed. It could declare this entire event a fluke, a stain upon Xelari dominance that needed to be erased. But that wouldn't change what had happened here today. The Hunt Lord could feel it, a ripple in the Xelari hierarchy. The nobles had seen something they could not unsee. What happens when the prey starts hunting back? The Hunt Lord's claws tapped slowly against the armrest of its throne. Then it made its choice. I declare the human victorious. The words spread like wildfire through the coliseum. Whispers, then murmurs, then a roaring wave of chittering approval. A declaration etched in history. The human had not merely survived, he had won, the first and only human champion of the Xelari hunt. The Hunt Lord's eye gleamed as it leaned forward. Tell me, human, what would you have us do with our new champion? The human wiped the blood from his lips, and he smiled. The game was only just beginning. The galaxy would hear of this. The Xelari had built their empire on dominance, on the principle that the strong hunted the weak, that the cycle of prey and predator was unchanging, eternal, and yet, here in their grandest coliseum, before thousands of witnesses, a human had shattered that order. Word would spread, not just to the Xelari noble houses, but beyond, to the other empires, the warlords, the merchants and syndicates who had bet on the games, to those who had assumed humanity was nothing but an amusing, disposable species. That assumption had just died. The Hunt Lord had declared him victorious, but what that truly meant, what came next, was an unknown. The human stood in the center of the coliseum, his breathing steady despite the ache in his ribs. The Xelari nobility watched him with new eyes, not as a creature beneath them, but as something else entirely. The Hunt Lord descended from its throne, each step slow, deliberate. The entire arena seemed to lean in as it approached, its segmented arms shifting beneath its ceremonial robes. It stopped before the human, and then it inclined its head, a subtle movement, barely noticeable, and yet, in the language of the Xelari, it was a gesture of acknowledgement. It seems, the Hunt Lord murmured, its voice carrying through the silent coliseum, that the game has changed. The human smirked. I told you, he said, you were competing. The Hunt Lord's mandibles twitched in something eerily close to amusement. The Xelari were many things, proud, unforgiving, dangerous, but they were not stagnant. The nobility watched, their ruler carefully, waiting for what would come next. A human had won. What did that mean for the Xelari, for the hunt, for the galaxy? The Hunt Lord finally turned, raising a clawed hand toward the arena's highest viewing platforms, where the galactic emissaries sat in their gilded seats, watching. Take your message back to your worlds, the Hunt Lord declared. The Xelari hunt has never been about cruelty. It has never been about slaughter. Its gaze flicked back to the human. It has been about finding those worthy of the title hunter. And today, a ripple passed through the coliseum. We have found one. The crowd erupted, not in anger, not in rejection, but in acceptance. A new champion had been crowned, and for the first time in history, it was human. The Colosseum's roar still echoed long, After the battle had ended, the Xelari Hunt Lord had declared its verdict. The nobility had accepted it. The galaxy had witnessed it. But far beyond this blood-stained arena, the true game was only beginning. As the humans stepped away from the battlefield, the towering Hunt Lord fell into step beside him. The crowd's voices faded into the background, the storm of chittering approval now distant. "Do you understand what you have done?" The human's knuckles still ached from the fight. His ribs throbbed, but he grinned anyway. "Yeah." He exhaled. "I made things interesting." The Hunt Lord chuckled, a dry, unsettling sound. "No, human, you have done more than that." It gestured to the sky, to the warships burning in the upper atmosphere, to the empires that had watched this fight unfold. "You have drawn attention. The kind that does not simply watch, but moves." The human's grin faded slightly, because he knew the Hunt Lord was right. The Xelari were brutal, yes, hunters, predators, but they had a code, a structure, a system of rules. Others did not. The galactic aristocracies, the slave cartels, the warlords, who had bet fortunes on his failure. They would not be pleased that a human had just rewritten the script. The Hunt Lord watched his expression carefully. Testing, measuring. "You have proven yourself here, but now the real question remains." It turned, its single gleaming eye reflecting the distant battle above. "Can you survive what comes next?" A pulse echoed through the air. A transmission. The human glanced at his wrist, where a small device had been hastily secured by someone, a smuggled communicator. He tapped it. Static flared. Then, a voice, a human voice. "If you're hearing this, congratulations. You did the impossible." A pause. "Now, get ready, because they're coming." The signal cut. The Hunt Lord's mandibles twitched, amused, interested. "It seems you are already being hunted." The human rolled his shoulders, feeling the weight of exhaustion settling in. He had fought beasts. He had fought warriors. He had survived a game meant to be unwinnable. And now? Now it was his move. He looked toward the stars, toward the incoming storm, and he smiled. Good.